Hello, I'm Liselle Sambury. I'm a traditionally published author and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought I would talk about some assumptions. So a little while ago, Kate Kavanaugh did a video where she asked people about their writerly assumptions or publishing assumptions, etc. and she reacted to them. Alexa Dunn also did a video and Michelle Schusterman also did a video. I will link their videos below because I thought they were really great and interesting, and I definitely recommend you check them out if you haven't already watch them. But I thought I would do something a little bit different because I really think they covered all the bases and I don't need to like go back over those bases. But I thought it might be fun to revisit the assumptions that I had about traditional publishing and debuting before I was actually in it, and whether or not those things ended up being true or not. I will preface this by saying they were basically like all negative assumptions. I think because I had heard so many negative things that those were all the things I was afraid of. So I think in this list I don't have any positive assumptions that were like, you know, like my book will be in bookstores across the globe, because I didn't believe it. So I'm just prefacing by saying that going into this. If you're like, did you have any positive assumptions? I really didn't. But yeah, I thought I would go ahead and do that. So let's get started. So the first one, and I would say arguably the biggest one, was that if you're not a lead title, you're gonna get scraps. Essentially, if you're not a lead title book, meaning that you are the book that the publisher deems, I don't even know how to explain a lead title really. The publisher has decided that you are super important and they're going to invest a lot of time and money in you, I guess, is how I might say it. But essentially that if you're not given that title, you're going to get very little. You're going to get almost no marketing. You're going to get almost no attention from your editor or your publisher or anyone. You're almost going to get no attention from anyone, like readership wise. The publisher is going to give you dirt, and you will be left feeling underappreciated, but you'll get your book published, so there's that. It's honestly a wonder to me, like having that attitude going into it. I'm like, why did you even do this? If you thought that you weren't gonna get anything. But anyway, that was definitely like an attitude that I had, that I really wasn't going to get anything. So did that turn out to be true? For me, no. For some people, yes. So this is kind of a difficult to answer bit, because some publishers, for some titles, if they are not a lead, they will in fact give them very little. But there are also some publishers who will designate books leads and still give them very little. And there are some publishers where you won't be a lead and you'll get a lot more than you expected, or you'll get what feels like a fair amount of attention and marketing and push. And some cases where you really won't. And so this has been a very mixed bag. For me personally, that was not the case. So I was not a lead title. I did not have a marketing budget, and my publisher still did a lot for me. I felt very supported, and I feel like I got everything that felt appropriate for a mid-list title and author. I didn't expect to get an exclusive marketing book box sent out, because that was the sort of thing that I knew was specifically for lead titles. So basically what I discovered is there are certain things that certain publishers that only lead titles are going to get, and that you from your publisher are not going to get, but that your publisher can also still support you in several different ways, and that it is actually, like, from my interactions of people in debut groups, it is extremely rare for your publisher to do absolutely nothing. Meaning they don't, just like they don't post about you anywhere on their social media. They put you out to almost no bookstores, and you are in almost no libraries. From my experience, from like discussing and talking with other debuts and authors, that experience was very, very rare. It was not super rare for your publisher to give, a very bare amount of marketing, as was something I observed, but On the flip side, the majority of people, from my experience, from people I was interacting with in the debut group, got a fair amount of support from their publisher. So they got into bookstores, in a bunch of bookstores, they got into a bunch of libraries. Their publisher talked about them on their social media in some degree. They made ARCs available to readers, whether those were digital advanced copies on things like NetGalley or Edelweiss, or whether those were physical advanced copies that were sent out. They did an amount of work. And so, yeah, it just ended up being a really mixed bag. But I think the very extreme kind of mindset I had about it, in that you were going to basically be like kicked into the dirt and forgotten about, was very extreme and was completely like unrealistic, actually. Because and then I think that also makes sense for me considering traditional publishing, because if you got absolutely nothing, why would people continuously do it? If you got absolutely no benefit from your publisher, if they never got you into bookstores, if they never got you into libraries, if they never did anything, why would that keep happening, is my feeling about it. But yeah, so that ended up being complicated, but for me personally, untrue. This was one I think I had much earlier on in my joining of the writing community and hearing about traditional publishing, but it was the assumption that you are not allowed to disagree with your editor. Meaning that if your editor says, okay, why don't we do X, you must do X. Even if they phrase it in a way where they're like asking you like it's a question, it is in fact an extreme and you must do what they say or your book is not going to get published or go to completion. And this is untrue. This is one that I found out was untrue. What your editor is suggesting to you are in fact suggestions. I'm sure there are always extreme cases. There's always going to be one person that is the exception to the rule, but in general, you are allowed to disagree with your editors. I know authors who their editors have been like, hey, could you do this? And they've strongly disagreed with it, and they have expressed that, and they've chatted out with their editor, and the change has been kept the way the author wanted it to be. I think the real thing about disagreeing with your editor is that you should have a reason that you're disagreeing with your editor because it is supposed to be a partnership. You're supposed to be working together. So it can't just kind of be like, no, I don't want to do that. And then they're like, okay, why? And your reasoning is because you're supposed to be working together on making your book better. And if they have a suggestion, the chances are that the suggestion is to make the book better. And if you disagree with it, you're allowed to disagree with it, but you should have a reason why you're disagreeing with it, to keep that conversation going so that you can both kind of be on the same page and understand where each other is at. But yes, your editor is not a dictator. You are not forced to do everything that they say. The next one is, your publisher will probably not implement your feedback even if they pretend to listen. I feel like for me, when I had this assumption, it was mostly in regards to things like covers and, you know, that sort of process, because of the sort of cover design experiences I had heard about people having, which was that, you know, you'd see a cover and you'd give feedback, and whether the publisher would implement that feedback would be, the percentage of them actually doing that would be very, very low. And so, was this assumption true or not? It's a mixed bag, and I honestly am not sure. For me personally, absolutely not. It was completely untrue. So my publisher didn't show me my cover in stages. They showed me the cover when it was done. And then I was able to share feedback with the publisher. I shared feedback about some of the details and the placements of some things. And then also I had asked for other things. And they did, in fact, listen. A bunch of those things they implemented. Not everything, but a bunch of those things. They did not just pretend to listen. They did, in fact, actually listen and do something. But I also know this is not the case for everyone. So something I will also say is I really wanted a Black illustrator, and I made that very much my stance from the beginning, and they said absolutely, we will try to do that, and they did follow through with that, and I did get a Black illustrator. So for me, that assumption was very much false. But I know that for some people, it does persist that their publishers don't really listen to that feedback, that they share their feedback and it's like, okay, and then nothing happens. And again, with sort of enough fair regularity that I wouldn't want to say this is completely false. But I also think that in cases in which you completely hate your cover, I do think it is worthwhile to still express that if you completely hate your cover, because it's a huge piece of marketing. You're going to be flashing it everywhere. But again, it still does not necessarily mean they are going to change it, because I do also know of authors who have completely hated their cover and have said so, and the publisher has not changed it based on their feedback. And if they have changed it, it's been based on separate feedbacks. So for example, Barnes & Noble has been like, I hate that cover. Nope. And then the publisher has changed it for that reason, not because of author feedback. So this is very much a sort of assumption. Your advance is a reflection of your book's future performance. This was one that got into my head when I started sharing my advance with others, and I had got some negative reactions. I did a video all about that where I talk about book advances and modest advances. It's called The Truth About Modest Advances. I was trying to think of the title of the video, and so you can check that out there if you want to. But I had very much gotten it into my head at that stage in my career that an advance was a reflection of your book's future performance, and that if you got a certain advance, your book was basically guaranteed to perform in a certain way, and that people who got giant advances were always going to have books that performed in a certain way, etc. And this was the feeling I had. I later got over that assumption, but at the time that was an assumption that I did have. And this is incorrect. The more that I get into the writing and author community, the more I understand just how incorrect this is. An advance amount is a guess by the publisher.
Editing Liselle here. Just wanted to pop in real quick to say, when I say it's a guess, what I meant to say is that it is an educated guess, meaning that the publisher has a profit and loss statement, so they have information that they are using to decide what advance to give to books. It's just that information, despite what they have, is more of an educated guess. It is not a guarantee that, hey, we've crunched the numbers and this is the magic formula and this means a book performs like X. It means they're using as much data as they have available to them to make that guess. So it's an educated guess is really what I should be saying here.
It is a guess of how they think your book will do, and it is also a guess that is influenced by external factors such as if other people are also wanting to buy your book. This is why things like auctions drive book advances up, because now there's competition, and that is influencing how you thought the book would do and what the publisher would have originally presented. Also things like preamps, in which the publisher is worried about competition from other publishers, and so they preemptively put up a larger advance amount to try and stop you from even showing it to other publishers. And so I really realize how wrong this is and how completely untrue this is. I know a good amount of books that got modest advances, that got advances that were around my amount, that were even less sometimes, that have had resounding success with their books. And again, I'm not saying this is a unicorn situation. This is something I've heard about several times. to the point where it's like, okay, this isn't really a unicorn thing anymore. This is happening this often. I've also heard about a number of books that are given very large advance amounts in six figures that then do not perform as well. I find often because their publisher, for whatever reason, has decided to drop the ball, despite the fact that they invested all of that money. And I know it makes logical sense that if you invest a bunch of money up front, that you would then follow through in the marketing of that book and the pushing of that book to make sure you're making back that money. But that is not how publishers work. That is, in fact, not a logic that they are operating upon. And so I've seen several times books that have been given those sorts of advances in which the publisher, in fact, does not really follow up on it, and resultingly the book does not really perform as well. And so then I've also seen the opposite, in which the publisher hasn't invested like a ton of money up front, but the book catches on for whatever reason and performs above expected and does really well. And the big thing also I've noticed at the end of the day of this is that nobody cares what your advance was if your book is doing well. Nobody knows. When they see your book doing well, they have no idea if your advance was modest or if it was giant. They have no idea whether you were a lead title or were not. They just see the book doing well. And so this was definitely a thing where I was like, yeah, okay, this is really not an 100% indicator. I think what is a much better indicator of a book's future success is publisher effort. So if the publisher is pushing the book everywhere, I find that the book tends to do well. And that's something that I've just observed. So really, like, publisher support to me is a much better indicator of how a book is going to perform than advance amount. Yeah, that's definitely my take on it. And also readership reaction. The reaction of readers, of course, also plays into this hugely. And again, readers don't know what your advance amount is. But I also think this plays in together, because if your publisher sends your book to like 200 influencers, let's say, and you have a good book, all those people get to read your book, it's going to have a bigger impact than if your publisher sends your book to like 20 influencers, in that people may just not be exposed to your book and therefore not have the ability to read it and have that reaction on a larger scale than they could with publisher effort. This is more for general author life, but the assumption was that I will be drowning in deadlines and I will never have time to work on anything not contracted, and I will be super stressed out and I will be in deadline hell all of the time. This assumption is a bit of a wish-wash. So for me personally, it was false. And that is for a number of reasons. For one, I don't have a ton of contracted projects that I'm working on. I feel like this is very realistic in the case in which authors have they have a young adult coming out, and then they're also, the next year, they're going to also have a middle grade that comes out, and they're also in like 2-3 anthologies, and then they're also doing a graphic novel, and then they're also doing this. Like, people that have a lot of projects on the go, I understand them being in like deadline hell and like jumping from contract to contract and that sort of thing, because they have a lot of projects happening. For me personally, I have one contracted project per year from now until 2024. So then I ended up having, in fact, quite a lot of free time. Also, which was something that I hadn't anticipated, because at the time I was working full-time and I was also writing. And so at that time, it made more sense that I would really kind of only have time to work on one project at a time, and that would probably be my contracted project. However, now I write full-time, and so my situation is completely different in that writing is my job. Writing is my job. And so I ended up having a lot more time to then work on non-contracted projects. And like, for example, like working on my adult horror and trying to get that ready to sell, and working on spin-off ideas and planning ahead to this and that and this and that. Have I still stressed myself out somehow doing that despite not feeling pressure from contracted projects? Yes. So this ended up being kind of a complicated assumption, because I, despite having no, my real deadlines that are contracted are fine, and I have managed to stress myself out by in between adding so many different little projects that don't have a real deadline that I've attached artificial deadlines to. So that is a separate thing, and that is a me personally thing. But in the grand scheme of things, I think it really depends. People that have a much higher workload are going to have a lot of deadlines and may in fact frequently be in deadline hell, versus if you have a fewer amount of contracted projects, you are going to have more flexibility, versus also if you are writing while you have a full-time job, versus like not having a full-time job, or if you are writing versus having a full-time job and children versus not having children, or not having a full-time job and having children versus, you know what I mean? Like, there are different factors that will play into this. But for me personally, it was like kind of a mixed bag. It wasn't the real deadlines, it was false deadlines that I set myself that made things stressful, but I'm working through that. The next one was, people are going to tag me in bad reviews and it is going to be terrible. True. But not as true as I thought it was going to be, if that makes sense. So in fact, I don't usually, though I have had an experience of a full-on negative review that was put not even on a like taggable system. But anyway, it's rare that I get tagged in something that is 100% negative. For me as an author, that is something rare. But I do get tagged in what I think people feel are mostly positive reviews, and so they're like, I'll tag you because it's like mostly positive. But then something gets snuck in there that isn't positive at all. And it has a similar effect, honestly. So yeah, I did get tagged in those, and it did suck. Was in fact correct about that. And then also this additional sort of layer of like, there is now a subsect of people that feel very strongly that authors must read all of their reviews, and it is otherwise disrespectful to the reviewer and the readers, which I in fact very much disagree with, because I think reviews are for other readers. They're not critiques for authors. And even if you're thinking like, well, why can't you listen to my constructive criticism? It's specific to that book. That is not going to be changed ever. And so it's kind of like, that isn't actually helpful constructive criticism, because it's going to be irrelevant to my next book. It'll almost always be irrelevant because it is usually something very specific to a book that you cannot change. In traditional publishing, it might be a different story for self-publishing, in which you could in fact change that book if you wanted to, assuming that you're doing like an online only, or that you're just kind of like, okay, this is the printings going forward, versus that not super being a thing in traditional publishing. You can change some things. For example, you can have wording changed in like printings going forward and things like that. But for example, if you have a very large print run, you have like a 20,000 book print run, which I think, I don't know, is it very large? I'm not sure. But you have that sort of book print run, like all those books are not going to change, and potentially you may not have another print run at all, and more books may never be printed. And if you don't get a paperback, then definitely more books are not going to be printed, in which case it's kind of like that constructive criticism is not going to be applied. But I'm the sort of person that very much feels like reviews are for reader spaces, that if you want to interact with me in a public forum, that you can, but that reviews are not for authors to learn to be better authors. Yeah, so that was an assumption that was unfortunately true. And this one was, I probably won't see many copies of my books in stores or in libraries. So this was, I think, maybe more of a protective assumption, because I had heard, stories of authors going into bookstores and getting excited to see their book and their book is not there, and how that was sad for them, and how that was really depressing, and how that made them feel not great. And so I was kind of like coaching myself so that when I went into a bookstore, if I didn't see my book, I wouldn't be sad, because I'd be like, it's okay. And in fact, I would, like, before I went to a bookstore, I would go to look it up and see if my book was there. So that I wouldn't go in and be like upset. And for me, this did end up being very false. And I think that is for several distinct reasons. So in my case, I live in Canada. Indigo is my big bookstore, which is basically like Barnes & Noble in Canada. And so Blood Like Magic was the July Indigo staff pick of the month. This meant that it was going to be stocked. Basically, in like any Indigo, it was going to be stocked. It was going to be rare, in fact, for it to not be stocked in an Indigo. I also didn't realize they were also going to have a very large amount of stock. So for me personally, it like, once that happened, it became a complete non-thing. And I felt very much that if I was going to go into an Indigo bookstore or a Kohl's bookstore, I was going to see my book there, because of it being the staff pick of the month. And so that really quashed things. But the flip side was, in the States, I really wasn't sure how that experience was going to be in terms of like major Barnes & Noble stores. But also I wasn't in the States at all, which I also hadn't planned to be a thing for my debut year. I thought I'd like jaunt over to New York, but then, the Panini happened and that was no longer going to be a thing. So I didn't have to worry about going into bookstores in the US and not seeing my book there, because I wasn't going to be doing that. But on the flip side, a lot of people tagged me, and I was honestly really like pleasantly shocked at all the different places my book was in the US, and like on like prominent displays and things like that. So I was actually really like pleasantly surprised and shocked by that. And then the libraries. So Blood Like Magic was also a Junior Library Guild pick. And so I knew that that meant it was probably going to be in a bunch of libraries. So that also squashed that. And then what else happened? Oh, the Canadian libraries, it's like, I'm confused about how all of that interacts, but one of my friends of a friend that like works in libraries had also said that my book was in like a library catalog type thing prominently. I'm very badly explaining this, but essentially like in a big Canadian library thing, that it was being presented in a way that made me think, okay, a bunch of Canadian libraries will probably also have it stocked. So that also became a non-thing. So it's, for me, it ended up being false, but I also understand why for other people it can still be kind of a I think if you're a lead title, it's like, I feel like you can feel confident you're going to be stocked in a lot of bookstores, but I also think it depends, like knowing on your print run numbers as well. So if you have a smaller print run, then you may not be in as many bookstores simply because there are not that many copies. But I also think this can fluctuate depending, like if your book picks up, then libraries and bookstores and what have you will start ordering it more. So for me, this ended up being false because of, I find, very specific circumstances. But I do think that this is still a thing that like happens sometimes. I think the great thing is looking up the bookstore you want to go to and checking their online thing to see if they have your book on stock, and that way you don't have to like stress about just like walking in and whether you're gonna see it. I think that's just the way to go. So yeah, but a mixed bag assumption wise. I did think of a positive assumption that I had. And it's gonna be kind of painful because the one positive assumption I had was in fact incorrect. But I assumed that I would 100% publish my have rights in the US, Canada, and the UK because those were the rights my publisher owned. And that ended up being false. Which is like painful because like that was the one positive thing where I was like, oh yeah, this will like definitely happen for me. This is like guaranteed 100% this is a thing that will occur. No. Just because your publisher owns a right does not necessarily mean that right will be sold, which perhaps should have been obvious and yet was not to me. Yeah, I think it felt like it was more the rights that you retain might not be sold, but it felt like the rights the publisher had were like a pretty good done deal, but this is not necessarily the case. And the last one I have here is after my book comes out, everyone will forget about me. And this is also a mixed bag assumption-wise, because I do think there is a very noticeable drop-off after you have debuted. And I think that's why people like talk about things like toxic debut culture, because you're super hyped up in the lead up to and the actual debut, and then things kind of like peter out once your book is out there. And I think that can very much create the feeling of everyone has forgotten about me and nobody cares about my book anymore and everybody's on to the next thing and the next new release. And I think that's just kind of the feeling generally about new releases, period, in that once your book is out and the new release hype dies down, it can be really easy to feel like everybody has forgotten about your book completely. Even if they haven't actually. So this one is, I think the extreme of it is false. Like, people haven't suddenly instantly forgotten about my book because it debuted, but there is like definitely a noticeable drop off in like seeing your book on like lists and things like that. I think because so much of that is focused on new releases and upcoming releases, and less so on like existing releases. That's it for this assumptions I had about publishing and debuting, and were they true? I hope this was like fun for you and like some interesting insight. Again, this is always based on my experience, so people may disagree, they may agree, what have you. Everybody is entitled to their opinion, but everything I've said has been based on my experience and the experiences of other authors that I know. But yeah, that's it for that video. If you like this, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And thank you so much for watching. Bye!